Welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. We are a business technology podcast, and every day we try and demystify the world of technology and the impacts. We don't hide behind acronyms. We put everything in a language that everyone can understand and learn together at how technology is transforming our business, our lives, and even world. And today, I want to take a deep dive into the vast ocean of open source technology, which many might argue is the lifeblood of our ever-evolving digital landscape. And my special guest today is someone that has been at the very epicenter of this technological revolution. His name is Adam Wolf. He is the head of software infrastructure at Bloomberg. Now, Bloomberg is not just a name synonymous with data, news, and analytics. It's also a global giant that attributes much of its tech prowess to its superpower. Now, what is that superpower? It's simply open source technology. Now, Adam's impressive tenure at Bloomberg spans over 17 years. It's seen him be the wearer of many hats, from leading foundational applications to even helming communications and mobile teams. But today, his primary mission is to lay the foundation of which Bloomberg's army of 8,000 plus software engineers work diligently to roll out new integrated codes every day. But what excites me most about today's conversation is understanding Bloomberg's passionate affair with open source. Why do they see it as their superpower? How do they drive global innovation through it? And how do engineers really benefit from immersing themselves in open source projects? Buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, I'm going to be beaming your ears all the way to New York City, where Adam is waiting to join us today. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Adam. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Thank you for having me on. I'm Adam Wolf. I'm the global head of engineering here at Bloomberg. So I'm responsible for our department of 8,000 plus engineers. Been at Bloomberg about 19 years now. Have had a variety of roles, including leading the software infrastructure engineering team, which is responsible for the platform that our engineers build their applications on top of, as well as leading a variety of application groups, including our news and communications platforms, search, etc.
Wow, 8,000 engineers. That is just phenomenal. And there are so many reasons I was excited to get you on the podcast. And one of them really was to take a look under the hood at Bloomberg and the technology that powers everything. And one of the things that attracted me to you as well is I read that Bloomberg views open source technology as almost its superpower. So can you elaborate on that and how open source has been instrumental in Bloomberg's success over the years?
Yeah, so, one of the things we like to say is that Bloomberg is a 40-plus-year-old tech startup at this point. And if you go back 40 years, open source was obviously not a major player in the way you built technology or software. And you got software from vendors, but in a lot of cases, you had to build stuff yourself. And I would say gradually over the last 15 years and accelerating over time, we've kind of come to realize and come to adopt open source software as a better starting point. And it's a better starting point than either building from scratch ourselves, which can be expensive and, you don't always have the most robust featured solutions. The documentation's not always as good. And a better alternative than third-party commercial products where when you have a problem, you're stuck. If you want to take it in a different direction, you're waiting for a vendor's timelines and support. Whereas with open source, if you want to take it in a direction, that's your responsibility and your prerogative. And so we've found open source to really allow us to better support the needs of our business, frankly. We started out in a few places like the solar community. Obviously, we've been building on Linux for a while, and we've built up gradually over time from kind of being users to being contributors of bug fixes to building major features. We contributed learning to rank back to solar several years back, spawning projects. We were one of the original contributors to what's now the KServe project under CNCF. We recently open sourced a project called Memray in the Python space. And so I think our evolution has been gradual, but if you look at where we are now versus where we started, I think it's a pretty dramatic shift.
It really is. And I would imagine with over 17 years at Bloomberg, you must have witnessed firsthand the evolution of open source within the entire organization. So are you able to share any other insights on Bloomberg's journey in adopting and leveraging open source?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a cultural shift to really first look to see, is there something out there that's a good starting point for me? And I think recognizing that you benefit from the expertise and the thought that's gone into these products requires a real culture shift. It also requires a culture shift, I'll say the other way, in recognizing that open source doesn't just mean, hey, I'm going to download this thing and then I'm all set. That, open source projects require you to contribute, to be willing to understand the code and find out what's not working for you and fix bugs and make it better and adapt it to your needs. So I think that was a real cultural shift. And I think it's been great for us to be contributors back to these ecosystems. At this point, we have multiple PMCs on a variety of Apache projects, and we contribute back to the Python ecosystem in a lot of ways, both sponsoring people working at Python Software Foundation, as well as our own engineers who play key roles. And that's true of a variety of open source projects. We have an open source project office within our CTO group that kind of spearheads these efforts and handles how we collaborate with various foundations. But fundamentally, it's a grassroots effort, and it really comes from our engineers and to some extent a grassroots change in the expectations of engineers and the culture of engineers in the world at large.
And another stat that really caught my attention is that Bloomberg is even more popular than big tech firms such as Meta, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Alphabet in the open source community. So I've got to ask, what do you think, or what do you believe contributes to this standing, and what sets Bloomberg apart in its approach to open source? Because you guys got to be doing something different and doing it right too.
I'm flattered to hear that. I think one of the things that really does set us apart, I'll say two things. One is that I can't think of a real example in the open source space where we're trying to sell that product, where we're trying to package and sell that product, where we care about control of that product. We really come in as an end user and as a participant in the project without wanting to take control and be a vendor. And so that makes us, I think, seem more comfortable to people involved in the project, that we're coming in as equals. I think the other thing that helps us out is that we're willing to take a long-term view. And I think this comes from the culture of our company. And an example of this is our participation in language standardization. We're actually involved in major ways in C++ standardization, in Python standardization, in JavaScript and TypeScript standardization. I'll give one example here that gets a little bit into the weeds in the JavaScript world, but we recognize a number of years back that if you're going to have a large JavaScript code base on the server side, that you really need the kind of encapsulation that JavaScript didn't really provide. And we kind of built some clunky version of it ourselves, but realized that fundamentally was a gap in the language. And we worked with the community to standardize private methods and private fields. And this was a multi-year effort working with a variety of people to make this happen as part of the TC39 process. And as a result, now those features are available as part of the language and everybody gets to benefit from them, but it makes a big difference in the way that we can build our software. And that's not something where you get the benefits of that overnight or even over a year. I mean, this was probably a 5+ year effort to where we were really able to benefit from it. But we do take that long view in this. And I think that's why we're so involved in a lot of the language standardization efforts, where you don't see the fruits of your labor overnight, but you definitely see the benefits. And we like to think that we're making things better for everyone.
When I was digging a little bit deeper and doing a bit of research on you guys before you came on, I was also reading about your belief that engaging with the open source community is crucial for driving technological innovation. Again, incredibly refreshing to read something like this. But can you expand on that and how Bloomberg ensures that its engagement is both meaningful and I suppose most important of all, mutually beneficial?
Yeah, I think it comes back to being a user of these technologies and saying, look, the use cases that we're seeing probably do apply to other people, but maybe we can bring something that others aren't seeing yet or aren't having to deal with yet. Probably the most common example we see is scale. And we've seen this in many open source projects that we've adopted at scale and use at a scale that maybe most, if not all of the users are not using yet, but they would like to get to that point. And we've seen this when we adopted Solar Cloud a number of years ago. We saw this recently with the Ceph project. We're heavy users of Ceph for both our block and object storage. And when we started to enable multi-data center replication, we ran into some challenges that would only happen after hours, if not days, of running tests on a fairly large cluster. And the community was not seeing these issues simply because they weren't trying to replicate at this scale. They may not have even had the capacity to replicate at this scale. And so us collaborating with that, trying to find the issues, ultimately suggesting patches, working with the community on that is mutually beneficial. The product becomes better and we benefit from that product becoming better. We don't want to fork stuff. We want to contribute back anything we can do to make things better. And if that requires more work, I think it's worth it. It's worth it for the long-term health of the project. And like I said, I think we try and take a long view on this. If we decide to go off, fork a project, have our own internal fork, that might allow us to move faster, but ultimately it hinders the long-term health of the project, and that's not good for anyone. There are also, lots of cases where we've sponsored work, CSS Grid. We've worked with Igalia to sponsor in the HTML space, a variety of places. The other thing I would say is that we have a number of people who participate in the boards and leadership of various open source foundations and stewardship bodies. We have a number of people involved in the ISO standardization process for C++. Rob Palmer, one of our engineers, is one of the co-chairs of TC39, which does JavaScript standardization. Dan Ehrenberg is the VP of ECMA. Pablo Galindo-Salgado is one of the members of the Python Steering Council. And so I think these are, frankly, fairly thankless jobs, and we support our engineers in doing these thankless jobs. And I think hopefully the community appreciates that. And I know our engineers really appreciate our support in doing that and in the way that strengthens the community.
And I think it's also worth highlighting at this point that at Bloomberg, you are very proactive about the collaboration you were talking about there, but also sustaining open source. And on that side of things, can you tell me a little bit more about Bloomberg's FOST Contributor Fund and its almost unique democratic approach to funding and how that initiative helps in sustaining that broad and open source ecosystem we're talking about today?
Yeah, so I think it's important for our developers to recognize how dependent they are on open source for their everyday work. And rather than us kind of picking top down which projects we think are important, we went out to our developers and said, what do you think we should be contributing? And so we put together some funding for open source projects, and we asked the developers on a quarterly basis to vote on those projects they think are most important to them and most deserving of our funding. And so we give out 12 $10,000 grants per year, 3 per quarter. In Q1, we funded projects like Apache Arrow, Celery, Curl. Our Q2 grants, which we actually haven't announced publicly yet, so you're the first to hear, will be to Postgres, MakeDocs, and OpenSSH. And I think if you look at that, you see, I'll say, prominent projects that everyone thinks about, but also some behind the scenes projects that often have, a handful of people working on them, working on the plumbing that the whole world is dependent on, things like curl or MakeDocs. It's certainly not the project with the branding that everybody thinks about, but we all depend on it. And I think our developers recognize the importance of projects like this and really are proud and glad to be able to contribute to the sustainability of those ecosystems.
And when doing a little research about you, Adam, I also quickly learned that you're known as a bit of an advocate for career growth and mobility within Bloomberg engineering. So again, to bring to life what we're talking about here, how does working in open source projects serve as a catalyst for engineers to ultimately help expand their horizons, their skill sets, and their career prospects?
I think anytime you can work with a new set of people who bring expertise, you learn a couple of things. One is you learn from them. And if you're working on a project, I don't know, deep in the database space or the search space or the storage space, you learn from real experts in that space, and that helps you become a stronger engineer. But I also think that open source has a unique and valuable collaboration model, and learning how to function effectively in that space is an important, I'll use the phrase, although I think there's problems with this phrasing, soft skill, and so much of being a successful engineer is knowing how to navigate people as well as computers. And I think that people who get engaged and involved in open source really do learn how to be better engineers by learning how to work within a large community, how to influence without authority, how to be a leader, how to organize work and get everybody going in the same direction. And those things are important in your career, both within a company as well as within the open source world.
And although I might be guilty of making it all sound so simple, it's also important to highlight, especially for all the engineers listening, that it's not all sunshine and rainbows. And while open source offers numerous advantages, it does come with a set of challenges too. So is there anything you can share around how Bloomberg navigates the potential pitfalls or challenges associated with open source technologies, especially when integrating them into a vast infrastructure and I suspect a little legacy technology thrown into the mix too?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the challenges. I think open source software, tends to be free software, but you have to recognize that integrating it into a large enterprise and maintaining it over time isn't free. You have to pay for it in your labor and your effort, and recognizing that you're going to need to do work to integrate it into your telemetry systems, into your build systems, into your deployment systems, that you're going to need to do work probably to fix bugs, to make sure that the client libraries in a variety of languages are up to the same level. And you're going to have to maintain that over time. As the project evolves, you're going to have to keep up with it. And so you have to go in knowing that there is a cost to this. But I think what we've recognized over time, that while there is a cost, that cost is less, and that cost is less than it would be to build something from scratch, and ultimately you get better results. And so that cost is worth paying. But I think the biggest mistake I've seen is people thinking they can just download something off of GitHub and then be done with it, and not have to think about it and not think about the total cost of ownership of that technology.
Yeah, I suspect there's a few engineers nodding in agreement with you there. And finally, if we were to look into the future, how do you see that relationship between Bloomberg and the open source community evolving? And are there any exciting open source initiatives or projects that Bloomberg is looking forward to in the near future? I appreciate you probably can't share too much, but is there anything you can?
Yeah, so what I will say is, I think as part of our journey, we started out looking at what are projects that we benefit from, that we can contribute, and we started off fixing bugs and then building small features and large features. And it's really been only in the last couple of years where I think we've been looking at what do we have that's proprietary that the broader ecosystem would benefit from. And so I mentioned memory earlier, which really kind of filled a niche that nothing was filling out there in terms of understanding memory usage within Python. We also released PyStack earlier this year, again, in a space we didn't see something filling. We recently open sourced a message queue that we've had internally for some time now called Blazing MQ, which solved a problem that we didn't see anything out there that solved. So we pushed that forward, and we thought that the community would benefit from that. And it's something that we've been using internally for 8+ years now. So I think that's the shift in our mentality, is not just looking at what are open source projects that we should be a part of, but what are projects that we have that the open source community would benefit from. And that's where we're going. And that's kind of, I'll say, the next step in our evolution as an open source first company.
Well, a huge thank you for sitting down with me today, sharing your insights. But before I let you go, I want you to share one final gift with everyone listening, and that is a book that is inspired to you. Maybe you've read recently, maybe it's just something that means something to you that we can add to our Amazon wish list. I always ask my guests to leave a book for the bookshelf here at Tech Talks Daily. So what book would you like to recommend everyone listening, and why?
So the book I read for interest, just because I thought it was an interesting topic, without realizing how relevant it was to my day job was Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist. And in reading through that book, I don't think any of his examples were around software engineering, but there's so many things in there that felt relevant to the work I do, and I could relate to. He talks a lot about anchoring and estimation and loss aversion and optimism. And anyone who's been involved in software engineering projects in open source or otherwise is very familiar with a lot of these challenges. And I thought looking at that from the perspective of psychology and behavioral economics was fascinating, and I learned a lot from it. So that's a tip I give to anyone who's in this field.
Fantastic tip. I'll get that added straight to our Amazon wish list. And for everyone listening, obviously Bloomberg is a huge behemoth of a site there. So for anyone listening to want to find out more information about the kind of work that you're doing there or keeping up to speed with things, where would you like to point everyone listening to?
Yeah, so our site is tech@bloomberg.com. No spaces, no dashes, anything. And we have an open source page on there at tech@bloomberg.com/open source. You could, of course, check out our GitHub page, github.com/Bloomberg. But we've got a lot of great content up there, including all of our contributions to open source and to language standardization and a variety of topics.
Well, I record this podcast every single day. And one of the reasons I do that is, one, try and demystify technology, put it in a language everyone can understand. And two, try and think about how technology is impacting our world in ways that you don't automatically think about. And also, I think, get people thinking differently about big businesses, tech companies, etc., and what motivates them, what inspires them. And today, hearing about Bloomberg and why engaging with the open source community is such a big key for true technological innovation is a huge takeaway for me. But ultimately, how you guys see open source technology as a superpower, incredibly refreshing. But more than anything, just thank you for sharing everything with me today.
And thank you for having me on.
And there we have it, a deep dive into the world of open source, its monumental impact on the technological innovation, and the intricate ways in which Bloomberg harnesses this mighty superpower. And for that, a huge heartfelt thanks to Adam Wolf for sharing his incredible insights, experiences, and the transformative journey of Bloomberg in the open source landscape. For me personally, it's truly inspiring to see how open collaboration and the spirit of sharing knowledge can lead to game-changing outcomes, not just for an organisation, but for the global tech industry. So for everyone listening, if today's interest has piqued your interest in open source, remember that diving into this community could be a gateway not just to enhancing your skills, but making a meaningful contribution to the tech ecosystem. And I'm also conscious this is a passionate community that we're talking about, and maybe you're a member of that community. Maybe there's something you want to add to this conversation. Maybe you've got a question for me or Adam. Maybe you'd like to sit down with me for an entire episode and discuss a different side of this coin. Whatever it is, my door is open to each and every one of you. And all you need to do is send me a direct email, techblogwriter@outlook.com. If you want to send me a direct message, my social channels are simply @NeilC.Hughes on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all those usual places. And if you'd like to work with me, I can help you ghostwrite those CEO and thought leadership blogs, or even help you launch your own podcast like this, where you just simply focus on recording great conversations and let me worry about getting it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and editing audio files, all those things you haven't got time for. For anything like that, just go to my website, techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll also find 2,500 other interviews, not just on here, also my podcast with Netgear and the Citrix Ready podcast too. But I've taken up far too much of your time already, so please subscribe, share, stay tuned for more enlightening conversations with tech and business leaders from around the globe. And I cordially invite you to do it all again tomorrow. But thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.